I'd like to take you through some of the more difficult issues of the week. To start with, I want to say that the distinction between open and closed form poetry is not an entirely arbitrary distinction, but it's not an absolute distinction either. I've tried for many years to come up with a formula that is an infallible way to distinguish between an open form and a closed form poem. And the flow chart that I gave you is the best that I could do. But I worry about that flow chart because it gives you, I think, perhaps a false impression of the importance of this distinction. And it's really not that important a distinction. It's a common distinction, which is why we need to study it. But it's not an important distinction because all poetry is in some sense open and all poetry is in some sense closed. We wouldn't be able to call a certain text a poem unless there were something about it that restricted it from being in the set of things we call prose, non-poems. Right? So the distinction is not arbitrary, nor is it absolute, nor is it particularly important, but it is something that people study. There will be poems that people can argue about that are not absolutely open form or absolutely closed form, even if we grant that there are some open form poems and there are some closed form poems. Now, if we're going to have a distinction that says some poems are open form and some poems are closed form, then it's undeniable that The Raven is a closed form poem and The Sea Rose or Sea Rose is an open form poem. But it's not as easy to make every distinction as there is with that one. So, I'm going to try to develop that idea a little bit as we go through some poems. What determines an open form and what determines a closed form poem is, again, not arbitrary but not absolute. So, for example, this poem by Marion Moore called The Fish is a closed form poem. Why is it a closed form poem? Because it is written in something that we call syllabic verse. This is on your flow chart. Meaning that in each stanza, the corresponding line, it has the same number of syllables. So, for example, stanza 1, first stanza, first line, Wade. Second stanza, first line, Anne, one syllable, sun, one syllable, the, one syllable, etc. Second stanza, through black jade, 3 syllables, injured fan, 3 syllables, split like spun, 3 syllables, turquoise sea, 3 syllables, etc. If you count the syllables per line, that number of syllables will always correspond in every stanza to that line. Right? That's syllabic verse. We count syllables. This poem, which people are always gravitating toward, and I like that, is open form. Now, why would it be open form? Same number of words per line in corresponding stanzas, but not the same number of syllables. So, 4 syllables, so much depends. 3 syllables, a red wheel, etc. It's got the same number of words per line, but not the same number of syllables. That makes it closed form only because it was never part of English poetics to count words. Now, I think that makes sense, and I don't know that I want to go into detail to explain why right now. But the point is that there's a sense of an arbitrary distinction between open and closed form, which isn't true, but is certainly there as a sense. So I want to go back. I really want to, here's my chart. You've all seen this already, right? So if you look and see consistent pattern of syllables right here, that's what Merriam-Moore's poem has. I want to look at some of the difficult poems and explain that there are different poetics at different times, and certainly in different languages, that determine whether something is open or closed. Now, I don't expect you to understand this poem. It's written in Anglo-Saxon, or what's called Old English. Some people say, I can't understand Shakespeare because it's written in Old English, but Shakespeare's not written in Old English. Shakespeare's written in what's called Early Modern English. This is Old English. And forgive my pronunciation, you can check this on YouTube and get a better pronunciation, I'm sure. Nu wie schulen hergien hefen riches werde methodus mekta und his modstank, wera wilderfouder, swahi wundra jehuas, eche dreiten, or onstelda, he erist schop, erfen bernum, hefen for hofa, halig shippend, tha middenjerd, monkines werd, eche drikten, efter theoda, fernum foldum fria almightig. What is, I hope you heard, even with my bad pronunciation of Old English, the poetry of there, some of the poetry there, right? And it's based, as I said in the lecture, on repetition of sounds, alliteration. So just to take the easy example of the second one, the second line, the three M's in the third line, the three W's, and an extra W here just thrown in for fun, right? And in the fourth line, it's the vowels, so I'm going to skip that one. And in the fifth line, it's also the vowels. Vowels are said to alliterate in Old English. Consonants are easier to see, so just for quickness, I'm going to concentrate on the lines where the vowels, where the consonants alliterate, right? So, heaven as a roof, holy, and I forgot what skipping means. The middenjerd, that means middle earth. Munkindness werde, the Lord of mankind. So the M's alliterate, even though there's only two of them, there's supposed to be three, but you know, poets always change the rules a little bit. So anyway, Fearnum Folden Fria Almighty, right? So you've got two half lines and three alliterated sounds, and that's basically the Anglo-Saxon line. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is an introduction to poetry, and you don't need to know it beyond that. My point is only that the criteria for what makes a poem closed changes from time to time, but there's always something, and here is just a modern translation of the same poem. As we move through time, now we're about the year 1400. With the previous poem, we were before the year 1000. We move already into iambic pentameter, right? Because this is the French influence on English poetry. Juan dará brio with his chorus sota, see, da 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 da. The drocht of marcha perced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which vertu engendered is the floor, etc., etc. It's iambic pentameter, right? This is something that they're still using today, and we're still using in the 19th century, in the 18th century, right? This is straight iambic pentameter. Some poems were loose in their use of meter. This is an Old English poem, or actually a Middle English poem that I've translated. I didn't translate it. I found a translation of it into modern English because we don't need to deal with the Middle English. What Chaucer wrote, by the way, I should have said, this is called Middle English instead of Old English. By the time we get to Shakespeare, it's early modern English, and what we speak is modern English. But you should be able to hear, O western wind, when wilt thou blow, that the small rain down can rain. Christ that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again. So I want you to notice that there's a couple places where the meter breaks, that the small rain down can rain, and I in my bed. Right? So mostly, O western wind, when wilt thou blow? You should hear that iambic meter. Da 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 da. That the small rain down can rain. But we've got an extra syllable here, right, giving us a anapest, big foot, an anapest, and we've got another one here. But aside from that, those slight variations, it's iambic, except also here where the exclamation at the beginning of the line forces you to make a stress. So there's 4 lines and only one of them is a perfect iambic line, but it's still closed form poetry because that's just variations. It's when you get beyond that that you're dealing with open form poetry. Now I said in the lecture, and I also said here, that was the poem written before 1850? Yes, then it's closed form. That's the best defining feature I could come up with. But there are some people who will say that the Psalms are open form poetry, and they were translated in the familiar version in 1611. And nothing is beyond dispute. But again, introduction to poetry, we don't have to delve into all the possible disputes about these things. But you've probably heard the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, he makes me lie down in green pastures, etc. Some people will say that's an open form poem, although as I just said it, I can clearly hear the iambic meter. All right, so then we've got other troublesome possibilities, and this is one that I want you to think about. I don't know if I want to tell you what's going on here because it's so much fun to discover it. On the other hand, I've got a feeling in a week it will be hard to discover. But I'm going to let you look for it. But I want to read this poem and ask you to think about the meter, and then we'll try to figure out whether this is open or closed form or how Williams is using meter. This is the same poet who wrote the Red Wheelbarrow, and this is just to say. So you've seen some strong open form poems by him. In Bruegel's great picture, The Kermits, the dancers go round. They go round and around, the squeal and the blare and the tweedle of bagpipes, a bugle and fiddles tipping their bellies round as the thick-sided glasses whose wash they impound their hips, and their bellies off balance to turn them, kicking and rolling about the fairgrounds, swinging those butts, those shanks must be sound to bear up under such rollicking measures, prance as they dance in Bruegel's great picture, The Kermits. So I want you to think about that one. And then I want to jump to the end, and maybe I'll go back a little bit. But Swan and Shadow, this slide didn't come out perfect. This Swan looks like he's got a hat on. But clearly, this poem is a shaped poem, sometimes called the concrete poem. It goes by various other names as well. And the question to ask is not, is it open or closed form? It's clearly open form. It would be almost impossible to write this as closed form. But then the question is not just what is it saying, but how do you read it? And again, I'm not going to answer that question for you, but it might help you if you hear me read it. And I'm going to read it a certain way, and I'm not going to require you to read it that way, but I have to choose a way to read this poem and I'm going to read it in the normal way that we read English language poetry, top to bottom, left to right. Dusk, above the water hang the loud flies. Here, oh so gray, then, what? A pale signal will appear. When? Soon after its shadow fades. Where? Here, in this pool of opened eye. In us? No, upon us. As at the very edges of where we take shape in the dark air, this object bears its image, awakening ripples of recognition that will brush darkness up into light, even after this bird, this hour, both drift by atop the perfect sad instant now, already passing out of sight, toward yet untroubled reflection. This image bears its object, darkening into memorial shades, scattered bits of light, no, of water, or something across water, breaking up, no, being regathered soon. Yet by then a swan will have gone, yes, out of mind, into what vast pale hush of a place, past sudden dark, as if a swan sang. A lot of things going on there, and figuring out what it means is not even the most interesting thing that's going on there. I want to challenge you to look at Moore's poem without worrying about figuring it all out. People still discuss this poem in great detail, and if they can come to any consensus about it, is that nobody knows what it means. That doesn't mean there aren't ways to talk about what it means. This poet was clearly influenced by Walt Whitman in his poetics, in many ways, in many poems, not in all of his poems. But the long lines are based on Walt Whitman's lines, and Walt Whitman is the poet whose work leads me to say 1850 is the starting point for open form poetry. That doesn't mean that Whitman is the sole inventor of open form poetry. He's not. The invention was more French, actually. What else do I feel we need to talk about before we go? I'm going to talk about this a little bit. I don't think I'm going to read it. I'll read it just a little bit. This is in last week's list. I said there was something called the In Memoriam quatrain. This is the In Memoriam poem. This is the 95th poem in this collection of poems called In Memoriam. All of them written in this same quatrain, A-B-B-A. And that's why the quatrain is called the In Memoriam quatrain, because Tennyson used it so elaborately over many, many, many poems. Since we're not worried about avoiding history anymore, I will let you know that this poem, all several hundred, I don't even remember how many poems in it, are about the death of Arthur Henry Hallam. And that's the same young man whose death was the subject of Break, 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 also by Tennyson. But this is a poem about overcoming grief. And it doesn't really matter who died. The speaker is someone who's trying to overcome grief. So, just to hear a little bit of this quatrain. By night we lingered on the lawn, for underfoot the herb was dry, that's the grass, and genial warmth, and o'er the sky the silvery haze of summer drawn, the silvery hair of summer was drawn, and calm that let the tapers burn unwavering, not a cricket chirred, the brook alone far off was heard, and on the board the fluttering urn, and bats went round in fragrant skies, and wheeled or lit the filmy shapes that haunt the dusk with ermine capes, and woolly breasts, and beaded eyes, while now we sang old songs that pealed from knoll to knoll, where, couched at ease, the white kine glimmered, and the trees laid their dark arms about the field. Kine means cows. It's a plural of cow. It's a plural of cow. It's an archaic plural of cow. All right, so can you hear the iambic tetrameter, which is also the line that we use in ballad quatrains? All right, let's see where to go from here. All right, the one poem that I'm going to spend a little bit of time with is this poem, Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Not as much time as it probably needs, but because I've chosen this poem because it gives people a lot of trouble. I remember when I first read this poem, it was somewhere around 1980, and I just felt absolutely baffled by it. And I think with good reason, although I've now come to terms with it. It was a slow process. But you got to start somewhere, right? Some of the poems on our syllabus are poems I don't expect you to be able to read and feel comfortable with. They're poems that I'm offering to you to give you something to think about for the next 2 or 3 decades of your life, if you're interested in doing that. But I'll try to help you with this more than my British literature teacher helped me back in 1980 or 81. So the poem is, according to Coleridge, something that came to him in a dream. He was smoking opium, which he was addicted to opium, and he fell asleep, and he dreamed. He didn't dream the scene. He dreamed the poem. Hundreds of lines, he said. He dreamed hundreds of lines of this poem. And he woke up with the poem in his head, and he wrote it down immediately. But when he got to the word paradise, somebody knocked on his door, and he had to go downstairs and talk with the person, whoever it was. And then when the person left, he went back upstairs, and he found he couldn't remember any more of it, so he had to stop. He said he published it as an experiment or a curiosity, but people have been curious about it ever since. Some people have doubted his story about the dream. But some parts are very, I won't say very clear, but become quite clear once you've talked about them. And if you've seen a really awful movie starring Olivia Newton-John and Gene Kelly called Xanadu, I want you to forget that. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover. A savage place, and as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermittent burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chafy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion. Through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns, measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. a damsel with a dulcimer. In a vision once I saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, this his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. All right, so you might have picked up that this poem, the first two stanzas are about the mystical, magical eruption that created a place called Xanadu, or at least a place in Xanadu. That's 5 miles around. And the last stanza brings you back to the poet who, through music or poetry, longs to recreate that extraordinary, romantic, natural place. So I'll take it a little bit slowly, not too slowly. We'll be done soon. So in a place called Xanadu did Kubla Khan, I don't think we should confuse Kubla Khan with the historical Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome decree. So he said, I want you to build me a pleasure dome where Alph, the first word of the Greek alphabet is alpha. The sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So in this place where the sacred river ran, it's a very mythic world. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, so I guess that would be 10 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round. A wall with towers surrounded this 10 miles of land where the sacred pleasure dome, the stately pleasure dome, was going to be built. And there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, sinuous like a snake, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. So it's a description of the place with the sinuous rills and the forests and the hills and the spots of greenery. But now that's the general look, and now he's going to look specifically at that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedar cover. I believe cedar is with cedar trees, and a cover would be like a grove, a place that is covered with cedar trees where you could find cover underneath. That would be my speculation about what's being said there. A savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon, was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. See, this is all kind of mystical and kind of odd, spiritual, or pagan would be a good word. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast, thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced. So this is a very sexual kind of image where a fountain is forced with fast, thick, panting sounds out of the ground. It's a phallic image. Amid whose swift half intermittent burst, and it bursts, so it's more sexual imagery. Huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chafy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks, at once and ever, it flung momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with amazing motion through wood and dale, the sacred river ran, then reached those caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless sea. This reminds you of Emily Dickinson's poem last week. This big kind of sexual activity, but it's the earth, right? It's a sexual energy that's emerging out of the earth, causing all of this ruckus, and then sinking calmly into the lifeless ocean. And amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves. So the sun is over the pleasure dome, and its shadow is floating on the waves. Where was heard the mingled measure from the mountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. All right, so that's the end of the description of this pleasure dome in Xanadu. And now he's going to reflect on what he just described. A damsel with a dulcimer. A dulcimer is an instrument that you play with hammers, but it's a stringed instrument that you play with hammers. In a vision once I saw it was an Abyssinian maid, and that's kind of a romantic locale for poets like Coleridge. And on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me. It was such a beautiful song, and remember, song is a metaphor for poetry, that with music long and loud and long I would build that dome in air, right? Built out of poetry, built out of music. This poem is the building of that pleasure dome. That sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard would see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. So he's kind of mystified and becomes this mythic figure through the song. Weave a circle round him thrice, and again that seems like a kind of pagan moment in the poem. And close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. And the power of poetry, the power of art and music to reproduce this pleasure dome. All right, I haven't got to the end of this poem or to any of the poems. We never worry about getting to the end of things. We just want to keep going further and further. And I hope that will give you a beginning to this poem and to some of the other poems. So I hope I didn't go too fast. If I did, let me know. We can slow down and talk more in the discussion board. But I think that should do it for today. Good luck this week.